John Willis. I am so psyched, to talk with you today. Thanks so much for joining. How you doing?
My pleasure, buddy. Yeah, we go back a ways here, huh?
We do. Yeah, we've done some really, I think, really great things, for the industry, as well. And it's like it's always a pleasure to work with you and to chat with you as well. So, like I said, I've been looking forward to this like really all day. I have you on my calendar for a while. So
Yeah, yeah.
thanks. So thanks for joining. Also, thanks for being a part of the AI Networking Summit. I do want to get to that and talk a little bit about that and about your presentation there about shadow AI as well.
Sure.
Really important topic, kind of right on topic, frankly. So I thought maybe a good way that we can start is I'd like for you to kind of share with everyone like a little bit of your career journey because it's really been you know fabulous. It's like you've really have been involved in so many different startup companies over the years. You like I kind of view you as one of the founding fathers of the DevOps movement, and community. So your career has not only been to kind of to support your family, clearly, but you've really made these really great contributions all along the way. And I think I'd like to start with making sure everybody knows that.
Sure. I mean, another way to put it is I'm as old as dirt, right? But yeah, no,
3 billion years.
I had a great career. I mean, I think it's sort of not to get too meta, but it's for anybody younger who's listening, it's who you sort of learn to listen to and meet. Like our relationship, right? Like I think you know. I think I was introduced to you very early, but we had a great conversation, and it just extended into sort of a career relationship. And so I've just been fortunate to have that ability to seek out people who I feel I can collaborate really well with, right? And the people who you can't, I just sort of like don't put too much gravity into it, right? And so yeah, I think in my presentation I gave at the AI summit at ONUG, I talked about, I was going to think of like if a lot of people maybe don't know me as much as in the DevOps world, and I say, what, why should they listen to me? So I made this sort of graph of like the 5 decades I've been doing this stuff,
Uh,
even going back to automation of operator consoles. My first startup was a company where we were doing screen scraping to tie together all these different consoles and console automation and things like CICS and IMS, if that makes any sense to anybody, right? And we had a startup and we sort of went through it, we sold it, and then I moved into distributed computing because mainframes were supposedly dead, 40 years ago.
I know. Yeah.
Right? They just can't get rid of those guys. But so we all switched off to distributed computing, and I did my first sort of startup there. And then just quickly to roll through, I just right place, right time. When I did a large scale Tivoli consulting business, training, implementation, all Fortune 500 clients, and I sold my part of the business, had a non-compete, and I just started looking at the open source alternatives, and that just opened up a whole new world where I started learning about open source monitoring tools and primary configuration management. I was, got early in on things like CF Engine, Puppet, and then actually took a position with Chef. I was the seventh person in there. I was the old guy there, and did
Wow.
that. Sort of went
Mm.
through that, and then the DevOps movement was starting right at the beginning there. So sort of followed. Was the only American the first DevOps days. Created the first DevOps days in the U.S. In fact, most of the major cities I started. I co-wrote the DevOps handbook, and then I get bored easy, and this thing called containers, Docker came along, and I created
Mm.
another startup where I sold a software-defined networking solution, Open vSwitch, if people. And at this hour, I think I got connected with you
Yeah.
at Scale, which was at Scale in a bigger way than just sort of meeting at conferences. I sold this software-defined networking solution to Docker. It was called Socket Plane. We sold it before we even got started, and then sort of got involved in some of the early cloud projects that we worked on together with ONUG, and really just been did a couple more startups and written at this point I think I've had like 10 plus startups and like 12 books, DevOps Handbook, wrote Beyond the Phoenix Project with Gene Kim,
Hmm.
a couple other books, and yeah, and then my latest book, which I'd love to talk to you about.
Yeah, what I'd say that it's a kind of a storied career, of both authoring books, which are kind of like these big nuggets of, of information and knowledge, to kind of distribute and to share, with others, and then taking that and then kind of in essence, encapsulating that into a company, to deliver value. So it's like, yeah, you've done that a lot, So really, congratulations to you, and thank you, for like all that work, that you made these contributions to the industry. Yeah, I think like you and I got connected. It was right around the time when you were doing, your kind of software defined networking stuff, and I think so that had to be, 12 years ago, 12, 13 years ago, time
Yeah,
frame,
yeah, yeah.
and so yeah, so it's been great to have the collaboration with
What,
you and for you to get involved.
what's ironic about that, I guess sometimes I'm way a little too far ahead of the curve. I mean, that was like about 2012 or something like that, and I was sort of bored with DevOps at that point. I thought
Uh,
DevOps was too boring in 2012, and we sort of started mulling around this idea, well, like, what is the network? What's DevOps for network meaning? And that sort of bumped me into some people who were doing some real serious work with, Madhu Venkapali, who was the first committer of Open Daylight, and I ran into him, and we realized Docker had a real blind spot in terms of networking,
hmm,
and he had been doing some really big work with Red Hat and Open vSwitch, and we just came up with this idea like, why can't we use Open vSwitch for Docker? And that's why we created the startup. And then yeah, around
oh,
that time we were sort of the whole SDN thing, and Onug was such a vanguard for that whole movement. Like it was the best place to learn not only what like go to one of those events and learn everything you needed to know up to that point, but you could get
hmm,
the large banks and the large institutions and find out what they were saying about it. So and
yeah.
and you
Hmm.
continue that today even with AI. It's one of the best. I brought one of my friends from PagerDuty, and the last one, he said, "I'm going back and telling them we need to sponsor, this event." So,
Well, that's a great voice of endorsement right there. That's
yeah.
awesome. Well,
So congrats
that's
to
great.
you, my friend. Yeah. So, yeah.
Well, thank you. It's been fun, and I think what's really cool about it, it's like one, there's a lot of work that goes into like kind of putting these things together. But it's like all of the interactions that happen during them that you don't get to see, but sometimes you hear about later on. Companies getting acquired, people getting new positions, companies being formed, and a lot of it starts from, the interactions that they had, there. And I think that I never realized that, early on this, doing this kind of work. But that's like, I think one of the best, feelings that I get from kind of like what we do is that
Well, I
you
judge
know
I judge a conference by the robustness of the hallway track, right?
hmm,
And like I'm looking around, I'm seeing the CISO of Cigna walk around the hall. I'm having conversations with guys who run network who have done Bank of America, like, and they're pulling in like the head of risk from J.P. Morgan Chase, and I'm just sitting in the hallway having these conversations. Like there's few conferences where you can have those type of conversations just meandering the hallway. So
yeah, awesome. Well, let's talk about Demings, and
sure,
your latest book, first of all, let's start with I'm not sure if everybody knows Demings, and in his kind of like journey of profound knowledge, but maybe we can start a little bit about just giving everyone a little perspective of that, and then what inspired you to write
hmm,
it. And I think maybe when did you first become kind of interested in
sure.
Deming's work? So when do we start that? So first of all, like just a little bit about Deming's, and what he did, and then also what was it that sparked your interest to kind of really dive in?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So at the high level, Deming, he's the guy you probably heard of. Like if you ever had an industrial engineering degree or anything in the university, you've somewhere bounced around his stuff. You may have heard of him as the person that MacArthur sent over to Japan to help rebuild after World War II. He may have been referenced as the king of quality, the whole TQM movement, which again is a little bit sort of misleading, but lonely, and unfortunately sometimes even pinned to Six Sigma, which he hated Six Sigma. So,
Mm.
but the point is, and then if you haven't actually heard of him, then you probably heard one of his quote, God we trust, all others bring data. Like there's just all these famous quotes you see in almost every presentation. Or you've heard of PDSA, Plan, Do, Study, Act, or
Yeah.
those, or statistical control charts. Again, we can go on, but like somewhere along the way. And if you haven't heard of him, one of the things that was interesting about my book, I wanted to basically, I had two target readers. One was somebody I know who's read every operations research book, could quote Toyoichi Ono from Toyota. I wanted him to enjoy the book, and I wanted my mother-in-law to know, to say, well, how come I've never heard of this guy, right? And that's I sort of accomplished that, right? So
Yeah.
so that like that's she's when she read the book the first time, she's not in IT, not technology, avid reader. Her response was, I'm wondering why I've never heard of him. So
Yeah.
he's that kind of character. So how did I get
Mm.
involved with him? So we ran the first DevOps days in the U.S. I was the only American at first DevOps days in Europe, in Ghent. And I came back, and one of my sort of partners in crime on DevOps is Damon Edwards, and he, I said, we have to run one of these in the U.S. This was amazing. There was like maybe 50 people in Ghent, right? And it was a very sort of like a changing of the guard of IT, right? Like this idea, why
Yeah.
can't the hells and operations collaborate? And it was all these young people, and like I was already like in the third or fourth decade of my career, and I was like, it was a rejuvenation for me, right? It's like,
Mm.
Damon, we need to run this. So we run one in Mountain View at LinkedIn, the first one in the U.S. And I'm on a panel, and I'm on a panel with Gene Kim. Although I knew who he was. I'd read his Invisible Ops book, which for anybody in ops that's sort of a core, your coffee stained book that you always had in your backpack.
Yeah.
And but I was on a panel with him, and I didn't realize, like I didn't connect. I was sort of in a daze, I guess. And then once I got off the panel, my friend Damon's like, "Hey, that was next to you on the panel." I'm like, "I don't know, panel guy number 3." He's like, "No, that was Gene Kim." Like, and I go chasing him down, and I can't. He's gone, right? And so we agreed to meet at South
Mm.
by Southwest next, sort of summer. And he tells me about this book he's writing based on Elliot Goldratt's The Goal, the guy who created
Yeah.
Theory of Constraints, and it's a modern day rewrite. And Gene gave me a really good gift. He wouldn't give me an early copy until I read The Goal by Elliot
Mm.
Goldratt, and it was like a great gift because I've talked to people that read like the Phoenix Project first and then read The Goal. I mean, Gene purposely wrote this as a modern day homage or sort of new story, and I just fell in love with The Goal. I mean, it was just sunk in for my at
Mm.
that point maybe 35 years in this industry, right? And so I read everything Goldratt had. It's Not Luck, Critical Change, all his books. And a year later, we have another Dallas Days, and this gentleman Ben Rock, he's the operations guru I talked about earlier as a target reader,
Yeah.
and we're having this open space discussion about theory of constraints.
Mhm.
He's running. And I start talking about Goldratt, and he goes, "Oh, John, you need to go back to Dr. Deming." I'm like, "Who's Dr. Deming?" And he's, "Oh, and he tells me, like, I'm like, "No, man, Goldratt, I don't want to read. I've been like, I'm all in on this Dr. Goldratt guy." And he's like, "Just go Google Deming's 14 points and then get
Mm.
back to me." And
Mm.
I did, and I realized I looked through his history, and I'm like, this guy was sort of germinating these ideas at that time, almost 50, 60 years.
Yeah.
And like these were the things that we were literally just starting to talk about in DevOps.
Mm.
And what insight of this guy 50 years ago? In 1950, he's teaching the
Mm.
Japanese these concepts that America had just been, blinded,
Yeah.
like not knowing any of this. And we're like picking this up in cloud native and DevOps, and we're discussing these things. So I'm like, all right, I'm going to invest in this guy. And
Mm.
warning to anybody at this point, he is an all in, and it becomes like beware if you sort of research this person, because he just gets into your soul, because what he does makes so much sense. So I spent the next year literally absorbing everything I could, learning as much as I could. And at one point, it was maybe a year or two in, I'd been given present. I created this Deming to DevOps, where I wanted to show like how we got to DevOps a lot from Deming. And one of the things that's
Yeah.
got to be really, I'm always trying to be careful with, right? one, try never to be a sycophant, even though you are, of somebody. But the second is always remind yourself to remind everybody this is all about a shoulder of giants. No
Mm,
one person creates anything, right?
yeah, that's so
And so
true.
all these great things, it's just some people can put those things in a context that explains. And so that but I was deeply into him, and then and Elliot Gorat has this audio only book called Beyond the Goal, and I try to listen to it once a year. It is so it was 20 years after he wrote the goal. His
Wow.
observations of the industrial engineering, supply chain, all these things, and it really is an amazing audio package. And so I went to Gene. I said, it was getting target near 5 years for the Phoenix Project, and I said, Gene, why don't we do a Beyond the Phoenix Project? And
Mm,
we sort of gathered, and I decided to do all the Deming work.
yeah.
Like we sort of have a section on Deming, section on Go-Rat, and then some like we call the three stools of DevOps, like complexity, physical safety, those things. And I did a whole Deming section, and then Gene said, "You should write a book about Dr. Deming."
Mm,
And I just put it in like in a directory, started compiling stories. Over the years, I'd be finding these great stories. A couple more things. I've always been a fan of how Michael Lewis tells a biography and a technology story
yeah,
by
me
making
too.
it
Yeah.
accessible to everybody, and it's a great storytelling. So you learn like Moneyball. You learn the complexity of sabermetrics, or the Flash Boys, right? You learn the, the the complexities of latency arbitrage. You learn all this stuff, but you like
Oh,
anybody gets it, and you sort of whatever level you're at learning. So my
yeah.
goodness, what if I could write a book about Deming's story? His theories, who he was, and for a very long time, I was just sort of pulling up like story here, story here. I kept finding these great stories, and then when the pandemic hit, I finally said to myself like, yeah, you're either full of baloney or you're not. You're going to write this book, or you like just going to talk about it for the rest of your life. And I buckled down. I hired a consultant to help me really get my framing, and all through the pandemic, I finished the book, and the paperback was published in January this year. So,
Yeah. How awesome. All right. Do you have a physical copy of it? Let's take a look.
oh shoot! All
You got
right,
it. You
yes,
got to
give
pull one
me.
up.
Uh oh.
No, it's okay. John, you don't have to leave.
Boy, I
You
should
don't have to
prepare.
leave.
I haven't gotten that question on a podcast. I don't know why I haven't been prepared. But yeah, there we go. There we go.
Awesome. All
Like
right, great.
Botchagalupe. Yeah, there you go. That's good.
Botchagalupe. I love that nickname of yours. So anyway, I actually have a story about Michael Lewis and his first book. I
Okay.
think, and I forget the guy's name. I can't believe it.
Oh yeah, yeah.
But he was the guy who kind of was it. He brought which one of the financials public?
Oh,
Uh,
Zora Perkovic, right? Was it you talking about Zoran?
no, it wasn't Zoran. It was I forget. I'd have to pull it up later. I can't believe I'm going blank on his name. But I was serving on a board with him, and so it basically the book almost kind of like ruined his career, you know.
Oh, really?
And so he was telling me this story about like he finally had like he had a breakfast with Michael Lewis, after many years, and then as the whole thing was done, and and the one thing he says to us like you and that fucking book
Oh, that's
created all of this havoc for me in my life. And I'm like,
oh,
yeah. So to kind of have like, just to see the person, one of the people in that book that, he was really kind of focused on, and to work with
was it
him a little
was
bit.
it Flash Boys or The Big Short? Did
No, it was before that. I think it was his first book.
I know. I don't know which one to tell you. Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, yeah. I've run into a couple. The guy I mentioned, Zoran Parkovich, he worked for the company that in the Flash Boys that actually. So I got a funny story. Yeah, we're gonna run out of time, but I'm overworking with Barclays in the UK, doing a bunch of consulting, and all they're arguing about is this book by Michael Lewis. Because the whole idea of like, latency arbitrage, or being able to sort of the two sides of a bank, one being able to do inside the box trading, and the other
Yeah.
one selling sort of commercial, and is it fair, and all. Like, it was an interesting debate. So I got the book on the ride home, on the flight home, and I read it. and there was a chapter about a DevOps guy, and his name was Zoran Pervich, right?
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, why haven't I heard this guy? Like his whole chapter on this one guy, and who ran the sysadmin for this new. So what was the point? Where the day trader in the book basically found out he was not doing as good because he didn't know that there was this new form of trading that was happening inside the box. So he created his
Um,
own, sort of his own broker firm where they literally wired out the timing so that every trade would get to the exchange at the same time. And
oh,
this guy
right.
ran the
Big
operations and
deal.
infrastructure room. So anyway, I get back and I tweet
Yeah.
out and like, hey, he's speaking at an O'Reilly conference. And I say, hey, I'm speaking at the same conference as the guy who's in chapter whatever in Flash Boys. And he literally tweets back, says, hey, you idiot, I've been following you for 5 years. He didn't say idiot. I'm like, and then I got to meet him, and he told me all the stories about how Lewis was interviewing him, and all. So yeah,
Well, I'm
it's
trying to find, like, it's like, I don't want to take time on this, but Liar's Poker,
that's right. Yeah. Okay.
was the name, of the book, and the main character. I gotta, like, I don't want to take time searching here, but anyway, let's get back to, like, get back to the knitting. So Deming's, so like four major components of Deming's system,
Yeah.
of this
Yeah.
profound knowledge. So why don't we talk about that, and how, and you've been alluding to this already about its relevancy, to kind of like how we're approaching kind of systems today and building systems. So why don't we kind of dive a little
Yeah.
bit into that?
And I think that's the thing that like it was so when I went to start discovering them. I mean, one of the first thing you see is 14 points, and that's really interesting. And it's sort of like a checklist to how to think properly in organizational design, organizational culture. Um, but when you really get to the meat, it's something what he calls system of profound knowledge, and so going back to like how insightful this guy was. I know Shoulder of Giants, but he was talking about complexity and complexity science. Like complexity science really didn't sort of like even started getting sort of a foothold until the 60s, right? The butterfly effect, Lorenz, Herbert Simon, but Deming was sort of talking about this in the 40s and 50s, right?
Hmm.
And um, and so the idea of the system of profound knowledge was, basically everything we deal with is complexity, complex systems, very high complex systems. And so he looked at it like almost like, and I've heard him describe this, and I do this in my book, like how a great photographer takes a perfect picture.
Hmm.
The lens is made up of aperture, depth, and focus, right? At least three, right? And like you have to sort of look at all of those in combination. So what Deming said, which was, on complexity, which anything you're sort of trying to solve, understand, or change behavior or whatever, there are four elements to that lens of understanding complexity. And the first one is what he called theory of knowledge. And theory of knowledge is just, like we've heard it in so many different ways. It's scientific thinking. You might have heard it as PDSA, plan, do, study, act, like I mentioned earlier. But it's and not to throw out crazy big words, but it's really based on epistemology. How do we
Hmm.
know what we think we know? Because a lot of our problems in the way we think things, we think we know something, and we don't ever use any type of method or scientific method to validate that we know. And so we're
Yeah.
stuck in all these sort of judgments of we're going to change this. Okay, how do we know like changing that's going to be good? So the theory of knowledge is sort of the core first element of this lens, right? Understanding that you don't really know what you know. You can only sort of test and understand what you know. The second is what he calls understanding variation, and this gets into like how it always amazes me as I learn more about this how like anywhere from toasters to nuclear power plants use some variant of statistical process control, which is
Hmm.
analytical statistics, which is how
Yeah.
most instrumented technologies work, except for IT. And in IT we seem to not consider that, but it's understanding variation,
Hmm.
and this form of variation you might have heard of statistical process control, but what it really comes down to is if you sort of take data in time series format
Hmm.
and you put it in a certain format and use certain statistical tools, you can actually separate the process from the data.
Hmm.
And so what you get to see through these charts, they call them control charts, you get to see the behavior without actually knowing what's causing the behavior. which is a
Mm.
great thing.
Mm.
Because now you can actually have statisticians show charts to subject matter experts and say, there's something going wrong here. Oh, yeah, I understand what that is. So, I mean, that's a really short explanation of it, but it's a
Mm.
very powerful tool to understand what you think you know or
Yeah.
help you find out. Well, and it really is all based on like standard deviation and certain variant patterns. And there are just patterns that have been documented from all the way from Bell Labs to to the way telephones are made to nuclear power plants are made. And then
Yeah.
the third component, those two would be brilliant by themselves, is what he calls psychology or understanding psychology, which
Yeah.
that gets you into sort of motivation.
Uh,
So you can have all the sort of systems thinking, you could have the epistemology, you can have the variation, but you got to understand how the humans interact with these things. And if you're not
mm.
taking that into account, so again, this was pretty brilliant like 50 years ago thinking about this stuff, where the science is like literally only started catching up maybe in the 80s and 90s, right? To combine all this stuff. But biases, or, like we think about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation, right? We think it's a binary thing. There are like 8 or 9 psychological patterns for intrinsic motivation. Like, is somebody challenged? Is something relevant to that? So you could literally explore a complete dimensional analysis of motivation.
Mm.
What gets this part of the organization motivated? Why are these people motivated? Are we challenging them? Are we giving the right sort of intrinsic motivation? All those things. And then finally, the last piece, which again is to me, the like almost everything I think about organizational behavior, organizational design, how do we do improvement, is systems thinking.
Systems
And the idea
thinking.
that he ties all those four together to say you can't understand complexity unless you use all four of those elements of one lens. And like I tried to do in the book, like how do you take a perfect picture? You have to get aperture, depth, focus all in the right. And
Mm.
I think to me that's once you sort of get into that, then everything you've learned or everything I've learned over 40 years from anything I've read or understood or any sort of classes I've taken from Drucker to you just name all the stuff, this makes sense more than anything I've sort of studied or understood or tried to apply in any organization I've
Well,
worked
it's
with.
interesting, as you're talking about it. Yeah. So we have complexity, we have variation, we have psychology, and we have system thinking. And just from dealing with networks for all these years,
Yeah.
what a great way to kind of think about that. And to look at these really complex, large, systems, and to try to understand how better to manage them. When things like I love the variation discussion,
Yeah.
as well, where you can kind of separate kind of like what the system's supposed to be doing and the control piece of that, and have those two separated, so you can actually look to see if something's really going wrong, in that
Well,
system,
and if you
so
tie
it's
in that, we think about networking, right? Like, I've got a reasonable background in networking, but you think about the way we solve problems, we make assumptions first. Oh, that must be the router chattering or whatever, right? Or
yeah,
and then we sort of go down that maybe rabbit hole, maybe we get lucky and then we work our way back. Well, it wasn't that. And if you think about the four sort of elements, like what would we do? The first thing we would question is, wait a minute, like we don't really know what's going on. So let's assume the first thing we're going to do is just a scientific guess.
mm,
Can we look? Let's let the data tell us what the data is telling us.
yeah,
Not what some visualization that says, oh, the router latency is 04. We don't know because there'd be so many other contributing factors. So if we just separate the data from what the data means, and this is again how they build toasters, cars, and nuclear power plants. And so from the
mm,
networking, it's a perfect tool to like, okay, this network or this subset of a network has been operating within this level of variation for the last week.
mm,
Particularly on Wednesdays, it never deviates higher or lower than this. Now, all of a sudden, at Wednesday at 3 in the afternoon, it goes off chart.
mm,
That becomes incredibly powerful. The statistician hands that to somebody who says, "Oh, I know exactly what happened then." That's when we made the the update to the switches.
Mm.
Um, and again, you go through that process, and then you sort of make sure that the psychological, are we sort of like, is everybody just agreeing to agree? Like, and so yeah, and then again, always working from inside out from a systems thinking perspective. So
Yeah.
these are incredible tools for any domain, certainly
There,
network.
yeah. Well, you clearly got me intrigued. But let's think about um, as you were kind of doing a lot of the research on Deming. Like, was there one particular outcome that you saw? That was so big, so interesting. That kind of utilized his system of profound knowledge and like the major components of that. And that totally transformed, something like I would think the Japanese manufacturing industry, like, he's kind of like known for that space, but
Well,
but you might know others because you've spent the time really
well,
diving into that.
he died in 1993, right? And like his last book was really his manifesto. Like he up to that point was a lot of notes, a lot of writing, other people about his writing, and in his last book called New Economics is where he really documented system of profound knowledge. So I would argue that
Mm.
there wasn't, and he was 93 years old, right? So there wasn't a whole lot of time for the author to help promote like post 93. And think about the world,
Mm.
prior to 93 in the world now, right? I mean,
It was
like,
before the
it's just,
internet.
yeah, you
Yeah.
can't, yeah, it's just before the internet. That's all you needed to say, right?
Yeah.
So there's kind of two stories. One of the excuse the pun, profound things that happened, which was, he went over to Japan. There was a point at which, it was, Japan was in complete devastation. There were a bunch of people willing to listen to him. There was it was called Mount Kahakani, where they calculated 80% of the controlling wealth of Japan was in this meeting, and he told them that if you listen to his ideas, and these were like foreign ideas, even in the U.S. or anywhere,
Mm.
um, that like in 5 years you'll be a top economic power, and in fact almost to the day they were of top
Mm.
economic power, 5 years, right? So you move on. He sort of Japan does all this stuff, and then in 1980 NBC does the doc. So he's forgotten. He does this stuff in Japan. He comes back to U.S. The post-war, people have forgotten. Don't even know who he is really, unless you're sort of deep into academia and statistic and analytical statistics and that stuff. And the NBC does this documentary called "If Japan Can, Why Can't We?" I mean, it's a documentary like how come Japan's crushing us. So you're
Yeah.
not as old as me, but you remember what it
I
was like in
remember
the
that
80s.
for sure. I totally
Where we
remember
were
that. It's
getting
kind of the
beaten on
rise of
every,
Toyota,
yeah,
the car industry in particular.
yeah,
It's like,
demolished. Dr.
yeah.
Steve Spear called it, like a decimation. He used to show a slide of Godzilla just crushing GM, and but so
Hmm.
they did this documentary, and in the last, and I document the heck out of this book, the whole narrative of the documentary and how it sort of changed everything. But in like the last 7 or 8 minutes, they interview this octogenarian. He's 80 years old at this point, outside of Washington D.C., and nobody knows who he is. And the whole country in the U.S., if any of us who were living that time were like, "Holy moly, the guy who did this is an American."
Yeah.
And so, meanwhile, Donald Peterson, who is the CEO of Ford Motors,
Yeah.
watches this documentary, and a couple of things that happen. This is to answer your question. Like this is sort of a profound insight, and then I'll go to the sort of the second answer to this question. Prior in the late 70s, um, Ford buys a chunk of Mazda, right? Right.
Hmm.
And so what starts happening in the late 70s is the big dealerships and power buyers of Ford cars, they're making transmissions from transmissions made in the US and made by Mazda in Japan.
Hmm.
And large scale customers or large buying power customers start asking for exclusively for the cars that were where the transmissions were built in Japan.
Hmm.
And they couldn't explain why. The first it was, oh, it's that Japan bias, but there was the engineers went a little deeper, right? And the engineers found that when they took apart the transmissions, the specs were exactly the same, or the specs by design were exactly the same.
Huh.
And this is where I had my own little bit of literary license, not literary, but license to sort of explore. And I'm pretty much on target here. Peterson, and there's some great videos of the engineers once they figured out what was the difference. But Peterson could not get an answer from Ford engineers.
Uh
They're
huh.
like, yeah, I don't, it's got to be the same. Here's the tolerance level, here's the spec, and we're designing to spec. Peterson watches that thing, and the next thing you know, he literally calls Deming up directly and says, "I need you to come in here."
Hmm.
And arguably, Deming would only work for CEOs that were willing to contribute to the project. So there's kind of a funny dialogue where, Deming says, "Okay, it's great, we're going to work together." And Peterson's like, "No, no, 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 I'm the CEO of Ford. I can't." And he hangs up on him. I mean, like, again, I'm adding a little bit here, and this goes through a couple iterations where Peterson's, "Okay, don't hang up on me, guy," and and they bring him in, and he basically sits them down, all of them, and this is why he always made the CEO be part of this. He told him, the CEO, all the executives, everybody said that same thing he told Japan. He said, if you listen to me and you follow my advice, in 5 years, you will overtake General Motors.
Hmm.
And 4 years later, they do. For the first time since like the late 30s, Ford is back on the, like the leaderboard.
Yeah.
And I think the insight there was what Deming was talking about was like a continuous improvement. It was about variation. It was about understanding variation. Not to get too deep, but Taguchi's loss function, these type of things. And I think then Peterson was an engineer himself. Was like, I think this guy has the answer to the thing my engineers can't answer about the difference between the two transmissions, and he was spot on.
Yeah.
So that's
So
one
what?
like that's an
So what
incredible.
was the difference? What was the difference between the
So the
transmissions?
difference was that the this is kind of interesting, and you could get real deep on this. So for the deep industrial engineers, I will apologize because if I had to
Hmm.
explain it in gory detail, it'd be
That's
a
a
lot
yeah.
longer. But the bottom line is like the spec might have been um, like sort of like let's say it's 1/16th of a tolerance. It had like two sort of like a lower and upper tolerance, what they call go no go, and that was the design of the thing. The difference was American engineers would just design to spec,
Yeah.
whereas the Japanese engineers would always be improving. So at the end of the day, even though the American or Western culture engineers would look at it and say, well, if the spec is this tolerance, high upper tolerance, and this was the lower tolerance, and we're within there, then there's no difference. Whereas
Hmm.
the Japanese were like, no, like we just look at those as sort of the beginning point, and we're continually improving. So the difference was, let's say it's I forget the sort of the numbers. Let's say one was like 1/8, and these are not even close to a
Yeah.
spec for some sort of valve, and it was 1/8 on both ends, upper and lower, and the American engineers would be like, well, that's good, and that's what works. Where what they found through their research and understanding Deming's work, which was actually for a lot of complex reasons, 1/4 on both edges was going to be better.
Um,
The
so
tighter the tighter the variation, but it's not just the variation. There's economics to it. But the point being that at a high level, the Japanese engineers were always trying to improve the variation, where the American engineers just for years thought like
yeah,
if you're within spec,
yeah, like
then
set it, forget it,
right, because
versus
what the
continual. Yeah.
engineers that designed it said this is the way it works, and that's what's good, and that's good enough, and that's the way we build it. Whereas that was never part of there was sort of a built-in what they call Kaizen mentality in Japan, where
Hmm.
it was always about improving.
Yeah. Love that
And
Kaizen
so, but the
mentality. Yeah.
the second answer to this is when I was sort of writing the book, the Working Backward had come out from Amazon, the book about sort of Bezos and Amazon, and I started reading that, and I knew that Bezos was a little bit into GoRat. That was one of the goal was one of the books he made all his managers leaders read.
Hmm.
But I read a little more, dig a little deeper, and there's this guy named Jeff Wilke who is this phenomenal hidden story of the success of Amazon. In fact, when he retired, um, Bezos said he was probably the most important guy at Amazon, and I've talked to other
Hmm.
people. He's the guy they brought. He was a Deming MIT sort of supply chain industrial engineer, and Bezos was smart enough to know that like everything for distribution was going to change, they hired him. And he's the
Mm.
one who created the distribution centers, brought in data, brought in numbers. And I started realizing that Amazon was literally built a lot on Deming's ideas.
Yeah. Hmm.
But that opened me up to like, what would Deming do if he was alive now? And so the whole last third of my book
Yeah.
was about how Deming would address cyber, how we were Deming. And in fact, one of my
Yeah.
favorite parts of it is, if you're familiar, I know a lot of financial people in your sort of sphere, the Night Capital story. So I did a detailed, Night Capital is the one that literally lost what, $450 million in like
Oh,
45 minutes, was out of business in a day, right? It was a glitch by a system programmer that created erroneous trades on the NYSE, right? So I did a
yeah.
whole Howard Deming would have applied his 14 points to this narrative or system of profound knowledge, and it mapped perfectly. So like, even though it's sort of all what if, because Deming died in 93, I tried to cover from like the 90s, open source, cyber, all the things that have happened, and last third of the book is applying his ideas to say this is how Deming would have approached it, and
That's
it
really.
just
Hmm.
mapped so well to everything that we've learned over the last 30, 40 years.
Oh, that's great. Actually, I was going to ask you, like, how can you apply it today? But it seems like you already did that. It's like,
Yeah,
do you
no,
have
I
like
spent
maybe
like,
one example on? Can we like
yeah,
go into
I
like one
think,
example?
yeah, I mean, if you look at the, one of the interesting things in the Night Capital is, the SEC sent them a cease and desist, right? Right.
Hmm.
And they listed a whole list of things that they felt they weren't doing. And like even the idea. So what happened, real short story of the Night Capital, which was there was a testing trading program that actually ran in the exchange that never really got deleted from the system and got activated by a combination of a missed update to one of the servers in an 8 node cluster and a flag that was left on. So literally a test trading, literally designed to buy high and sell low. Right. That was what it was. It
Oh,
was designed, got turned on in production. And
oh,
so like you could start looking at like the principles of continuous integration. You could look at, how Deming would have used variation and statistical process control to sort of evaluate. Even the fact, I've got friends that work at other sort of high frequency trading and latency arbitrage exchanges or brokerages, where like the Night Capital went on for 45 minutes. So,
yeah.
people, I've been told by people, oh, that can happen. We can have a sort of, an Al Gore trading, an Al Gore going nuts, but it would never go more than 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Like we will even switch border routers off. I mean, like, and that's
Yeah.
another, a lot of examples. That would have been a sort of separating the data from the, from the process. And then,
Yeah.
like if you were running control charts or you're running the sort of variation and understanding it, you would have saw this incredible increase
Yeah.
of, sort of process, like, whoa, what's that all about? So it's just a number of like all the sort of hygiene behind DevOps was, I try to say these are counterfactuals because I wasn't there, but like in my way to teach you how he would have worked, like there were so many sort of bad hygiene problems at Night Capital
Hmm.
that like if you were sort of following DevOps, if you believed that sort of DevOps came somewhere from Deming, which I do, then you would have just, and in the book I just list out. In fact, I take the cease and desist, and there's like
Yeah.
7 or 8 items in there, and I literally map them to Deming principles.
Well, hmm. Awesome. All right. So, any advice then? For like, if like, where are you kind of focusing applying Demi to like corporations, departments? Obviously it's fractal, it scales. Based upon the system that you want to kind of analyze. I guess it doesn't matter which system it is. But you're both in IT and kind of
Yeah,
this industry really well, and so I would think that that's really where we would want to apply it.
I, I think when you're trying to understand complexity in organizations, right, the system of profound knowledge is a great way to start. Because one, if you think about the bookend between theory of knowledge, how do we know what we know, and system thinking and all the stuff in the middle, like, can
Mm,
anybody tell me there's a better way to try to improve? I think so that, so I system thinking, thinking like scientists, trying to, never assume that you know the answer, always experiment to get the answer, to
mm,
validate it. But I think what's more important, like both of us are interested in this sort of whole new generative AI thing, and I've been doing a lot of research on what is this Gen AI doing for us? And we can talk about shadow AI at any point, but and that's a very interesting thing. I'm very interested in that. But the other point is, where's the real opportunity? And so last year, IDC did this report, and they said that 90% of all the data in major corporations is unstructured data. And
Makes
you think
sense.
about it,
Yeah. Hmm.
we literally spend about 90% of our efforts managing the 10% structured data.
Hmm.
And like, where's all the value in an organization? It's all that unstructured, tacit knowledge.
Yeah.
It's somebody's spreadsheet. It's in a wiki. It's in here. It's in here. It's in here. And I think about, I'm not a big fan of RPA, and I'm glad you don't hear about it that much anymore, because I
Yeah.
think it was the worst, sort of example of compiled technical debt that could have ever happened. But like, that's what it was trying to solve. And I think generative AI now is actually, there's technical debt in other ways, but the ability to turn, one of Deming's best sort of collaborators, and some might say students, is Russell Acuff. And he has this
Yeah.
famous thing he calls the DI, let's get it right, the DIKUW, or sometimes it's referred to DIKW, which is
Yeah.
data, information, knowledge, understanding, and wisdom.
Hmm.
So if you think about the unstructured data, there's a
Total
of
gold mine. Yeah.
gold mine of data that needs to be turned into information, understanding, and wisdom. And I think this is what generative AI is, a non-programmable way to do this. It's not a script. It's like loading all this data and being able to turn data into knowledge or an understanding and wisdom. This is the true power. And so I think a
Yeah.
lot of that maps really well the way Deming thought about data, his disciples, his students thought about data. So I think the real opportunity here is not just sort of thinking about Deming's principles for dealing with technical debt around generative AI, and I've got a lot to talk about that. But I think it's that how he would approach, like if I was writing my book right now on Deming, I would have a whole section of how Deming, just like I did for cyber, what would Deming think about all this? And one, I think he'd be a big fan because he's, his business card said statistician more than anything else. So he would love the whole statistics and probability and probabilistic, non-deterministic model of solving problems.
Yeah.
And I think he would look at this idea of like where the value is, where we are truly going to get value out of, from data to human knowledge to understanding. And so I think that's where, like, I would really try to map, and I am trying to map a lot of Deming's ideas of what he'd be thinking, how his ideas work. And by the way, Deming was, so just quickly, I'm writing another book, hopefully done, Andy. It was going to be about the history of AI, very much in the Deming style.
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
and interesting enough, a lot of the forefathers of AI during World War II were in the same place where Deming was. It was called Aberdeen Proving Grounds. Herbert Simon, Norbert Wiener, Claude
Hmm.
Shannon, they were all working on ballistics, and
Yeah.
and uh, and Deming was there. It was the first calculus differential analyzer. So he was in there. He doesn't get any credit, and I can't find any proof that he is a
Hmm.
direct contributor to AI. But all those people, Herbert Simon, Norbert Wiener, those are all grandparents of AI.
Yeah.
So,
Wow.
so yeah, there's a really beautiful connection there too.
I love that. One, I love your your idea too. It just makes so much sense. Where like 90% of the data is unstructured, whether it's in your spreadsheets, it's in your emails, it's like in your presentations. It's like in the kind of the Slack channels that you have at work. And not being able to access that. There's like two AI products that I've seen that are kind of interesting, and maybe they're kind of models of what could be. But I think it's called Glue.ai, and so
Mm,
that basically is kind of it's an AI generated kind of alternative to Slack. Within corporations, so it kind of
okay.
absorbs all of your unstructured data, and so that you can now start to probe and query that. I think that's kind of an interesting, product. And then also when you go up to like X, I'm sure you've been there. You see what Gronk has now been doing, right? So it'll kind of take a thread, and it'll provide a synopsis of that thread, and then here's like all the data of the thread. So
Yeah.
I'm thinking. So when you're talking, these are the kind of models that are kind of like I'm thinking of, or that kind of show now where we can go so much further,
Yeah.
in this, creating new back ends and basically control systems, to how do you run businesses and how the business is actually behaving.
and and understand things that you literally, it's kind of interesting. One of the things I've found through a lot of, I've been running a lot of workshops. I do a lot of hack. One of my clients is MongoDB. They have a vector database along with a lot of the other, and we run hackathons, and I built a lot of workshops for how to build generative AI. In a corporation, how do you take corpus of your data, your standard procedures, your GRC, all that stuff, and put it in a way that it's the idea. Like, let's grab it from everywhere we can get. Let's put it in place. Let's curate it. Let's make it. There are tools for hallucination management, relevance. It's called uh, uh, observability tools for AI, right? So like that whole idea, like I can tame the beast. I've learned how to do that. But
Yeah.
the point is the ability to do this like every other week, the technology. So I be honest with you, I'd be scared to death to do a startup right now because
Yeah.
the capability of technologies, it is so rapid. Like the agents, these sort of mixture of expert agents and the things that I was just I literally before this call I was Microsoft is in preview something called Copilot Workspace. It
Yeah.
literally, you point it at a repo and it goes in and starts destructing the issue, opening up and creating a plan to fix it. So this
Yeah.
isn't just Copilot helping you write code.
Yeah.
This is literally opening up an issue and say, open it up in Copilot Workspaces, analyzes everything it knows about that problem. It actually then comes up with a plan on how to fix it
Yeah.
with
That's
code.
huge.
Like, this is, and then you think about that from, like observing, like, understanding, trying to comprehend. And one of the other things I want to point out, what you think is just fascinating, is um, these idea that you can just all this data gets vectorized, right? These are highly dimensional spaces. I won't go too deep into that, but in my workshop I go heavily into this. But the thing is, there are all these tools now for visualizing these embedded in vector spaces. And I'm telling you, Nick, the things I'm seeing, like if I just take a ton of data and visualize it, I
Yeah.
start seeing clusters of different sort of topic areas. And then I lasso in and I'm able to see at a scale potential places that might give me interesting information.
Hmm.
The first time I observed this, it was when I learned how to use all this stuff with my book. So I loaded my book into a vector, put it into a vector database, sort of use it for training, understanding. And then I used this tool called Nomic, which visualizes vectors really well. And I brought in my book on this thing just to see what it looked like. And I saw a cluster of Toyota, different colors for different color code parts of Toyota, different other subjects in my book. And I lassoed in on the Toyota, and there was a little sort of yellow button for healthcare.
Hmm.
And I was like, why is health there? There's nothing in my book about healthcare in Toyota. So I dove in a little deeper and I found that like somewhere in the history, and when I wrote about the history of Toyota, they were a loom company, and there were some overloaded terms that might have been sort of interpreted by an LLM as
Oh.
healthcare. But here's the thing,
Hmm.
what gets really interesting is when you start zooming in on like massive amount of data, you can start seeing these relationships that no way could get if you read the book or
Yeah.
you
Hmm.
did a text scan or sort of like you literally get to see a big picture of how your data looks like in an LM or vector. And when you start diving in, you get these whole new level of non-human capable insights.
Yeah. I love
And
that about AI. It's like I am so betting, for improvement of the human condition, with AI because of that. To
yeah,
be able to see things that that we either have been biased against seeing, or that we just don't have the kind of mental capacity to see. what have you, whether that's in drug discovery or whether that's in, treatment for, various, chronic illnesses or what have you. Those are, that's where I see, well, that's where my hope is, that
Yeah.
I see the positive side of this. I know there's clearly downside, and there's concern there. But I'm kind of punting on that and just thinking, okay, there's a lot
Yeah,
of folks
I'm
focusing
with you
on
there.
that,
I
you
mean,
know?
yeah, you could definitely spend a lot of time worrying about a lot of the things that could happen, but the upside is, at the end of the day, it's making the communication for the human condition better.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the end of the day, whether it's sort of how we run networks, how we run risk, how we write, how we communicate, how we talk to, our peers or subordinates or executives. Like we are all able to communicate better, clear understanding, and quicker feedback loops on how we exchange, data to knowledge.
Yeah.
And I think there's nothing but positive about that.
So I wonder, like, let's take a few more minutes that we have. And are you okay? Do you have, like,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
just a few more minutes? Okay.
Sure.
So I've been kind of like now starting to think about, okay, well, really, what does, if we kind of think on the positive side of AI, then what's the impact for the overall economy? And I don't mean in terms of like, oh, GDP is going to grow by, 6%, 8%, what have you.
Right.
I've seen these numbers, but I'm thinking more like, to me, there's a real restructuring that's about to take place. Like clearly, I think very large corporations won't need as many people, and I'm not going to basically just say, oh, you're going to lose your job, but it's more like, I think that there is a productivity dividend that we haven't realized, that we are going to realize. But I also think too is that it's going to open up all these really new opportunities. So we may see really large corporations start to shrink in terms of the number of people that they employ. But then also on the other hand, we see a whole flourishing of new companies, starting. So a real new kind of like massive innovation wave, that trickles across the world, with AI is like kind of one of the ideas that I've been starting to like think about and starting to, trying to put some context, around. And I'm not sure if you've thought about, what the impact will be. I'm sure
Yeah.
you have since you're writing a book about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, one of the things that's been clear since as long as I've been in this industry is this, there's something called Jevons paradox, right? And the most simplest explanation of it is there's always this counter to a balance to what we think is going to happen. Like, we think like some new abstraction or some new change is going to reduce, and it actually creates more abundance, and we can go back to even, in my life, the video stores were going to put all the movie theaters out of business, right? Like
Mm,
what happened after the video stores were ingrained after about 10 years? You went from one theaters to 25 to 36 plexes, right?
yeah.
Movies have been more robust, at least up to the pandemic. So there's this effect that when you make the abstraction, you make more possible use, you get more abundance, right? And again, that's a very simplistic way to describe it. I think, but the roles change, right? Like, we talk about right now is a big discussion point is some of these banks had, 15, 20,000 developers, Java developers.
Mm,
Are they really going to need 20,000? Sorry, they're not. They're just
yeah.
not, right? I mean,
Mm,
if you've used anything, I just talked about a Copilot workspace, right? That's solving problems, let alone um, that you
code
can
development.
get a lot more done with things like Copilot and different sort of tools now that are based on sort of LLMs. Um, but so the net effect is we create more abundance, more sort of abstracts, more opportunities, and so what people have to do is, we saw this in day traders, right? And I always forget the exact, I use this example so many times and I always forget to look up the exact numbers. But if we went back, 15, I don't know, somewhere longer than 10, less than 20, a company like Goldman Sachs probably had thousands and thousands of day traders.
Yeah.
Now
Mm,
they have maybe 100, maybe less than that, because it's all algo based. So we've
yeah.
seen this already. We
Mm,
saw this on Wall Street 10, 15 years ago.
yeah.
The reduction of like thousands and thousands of day traders, where now there's a couple of maintainers and there's like everything's algo based,
Mm,
right? That's going to happen with coding. Did people stop making money? Did the
yeah.
brokerage firms like go out of it? Like but you have to be prepared, and we've been doing this in our careers, to a extent that, like, you've got to be prepared. And so if you're the person who creates business value, then the technology doesn't change your life. And I
Yeah,
know that that sounds a little like as a white privileged male, right, to say that, and I don't mean it to come off as sort of flippant, but like you have to be aware of the technology, going back to, the industrial evolution, and like these things happen, and you just got to figure out how to navigate. And again, if you're sort of your career is, been the last 25 years Java coding, and you don't want to change anything,
that's a
but if
problem.
you want to like apply all your logic for why a bank like Capital One is one of the better banks in sort of so many ways, and you've been part of that, then get on board of the people who architect the new design of how code gets created. So yeah, I think that to your point, you know, I think the abundance and the opportunity and the business and the value, the design to value feedback loop is getting so short that that
Mm.
it's going to cause, at least in the short term, until somebody screws up something big again, a
Yeah, well, that
positive economic, you know, outcome.
awesome. All right, so John, I think that's probably a good place to end it.
Sure, sure.
This has really been. I always love chatting with you. I always learn so much, so much. So let's show everyone the book again,
Yeah,
and you can
sure.
get and we can get it on Amazon.
Yes, yes. It's actually in. I do it through IT Revolution, Jim's Jeans Corporation.
Okay,
Um, they're pretty good. They're still independent, but all they do all this for you as the author. They do audio, Kindle, and physical all together. So like
awesome.
like I know a lot of people I see authors will only have a physical book. Like right from the get go, all the books at IT Revolution have all three. And like today, for me, for research, I have to have all three. I have to
Yeah,
have one on my desk. I have to have the audio version, and I need to be able to do a search on the Kindle version for
yeah,
any book I read today. So,
yeah, for sure. So audio. Did you read it? Is it your voice?
oh no, their advice was to use a professional, and there's a whole lot of because I just the short version is recording a full book, right, takes a lot of different breaks. You got to do like a couple hours, and then a couple hours next week. Literally can take up to a month, right?
Yeah,
And unless you're a professional, you won't have that cadence. So it's not
yeah,
me. They they
yeah.
they proved to me that like chapter one will sound like this, chapter two will sound like that, and the professionals can walk right in. So they highly
All
they
right.
mention not to do
So
that.
is it someone who's British?
No,
Is it
no,
British
that would have been
accent?
kind of cool. Yeah, yeah. I got to pick. There was like four voices. Two
Oh,
of them were terrible, at least for me. One of them was really good, and the other one was pretty good. So I went with the really good. And so yeah,
yeah.
you did a good job.
Awesome. Great. So, John, thanks so much.
Yeah,
And
thank you, man. This was
yeah,
great.
and thanks for sharing. Everyone, go out and get a copy of John's book, as
Yeah.
well. All right. Great. Excellent. Thanks, John.
All right. Take care, Nick.